So, guys, I just can't appear on camera tonight to talk about AEW just because I'm in a very sensitive situation right now. And I just do want to talk a little bit about the show. I actually stopped watching the show because the main event is Orange Cassidy versus Claudio Castagnoli. We all know that Orange Cassidy's gimmick is that he doesn't take wrestling seriously. Why would I waste my time with that? And definitely a controversial show in the sense that I really didn't see any story progression, but that's kind of been lacking with AEW. That I think the story progression, I'll just say, it's actually very minimal, and they could have done a lot more. That they definitely emphasized a lot of really great matches, but ultimately the same things kind of follow with AEW. That they have to understand that television should be more for story, and pay per view should be more for action, or they should have said something like, "Hey, you know what? We this is Nashville. We were going to do a 3 hour show, and we're going to incorporate more story." So I want to break it down a little bit. That the show opens with Kyle Fletcher versus Okada, and they had a match with each other. Really great match. They go for a while. There's a bunch of reversals. There's a bunch of jumps and hard hitting moves and everything's like that. And surprisingly, Kyle Fletcher actually beat Okada, and I'm actually very happy with that because obviously, you don't want to show Okada as invincible. And I also feel that again he should not win the tournament this year because I do not like repeat winners because it's almost like you did all this for nothing really. So hopefully he doesn't make it to the finals, or they show that maybe he's a little too arrogant, like that's his weakness really. But they had the match, and then you ended it with them about to shake hands and Okada about to give Kyle Fletcher the middle finger, and then Okada just shakes his hand and they move on really. So you're kind of almost teasing, is Takeshita and Kyle Fletcher going to turn babyface? Is Okada going to be like the cancer of the Don Callis family? Like what? And also how Don Callis is really oblivious to all this stuff. So that there's a story in that as well, really. And then the next match you had was the Babes of Wrath versus the Triangle of Madness, the Sisters of Sin. All right, decent match, and right team won. Because really, if you want to make the tag team tournament actually mean something to people and actually get over with people, you have to have the right winners. And I think the Triangle of Madness. No, I think that the Babies of Wrath versus Tony Storm and Mina is probably the right match to have because you can kind of turn that into a rivalry because a lot of people love Tony Storm and a lot of people love Harley Cameron and Willow. Imagine if one of them actually pins Tony Storm, that would actually be a way to get them over really. And then you can have Tony Storm and Mina just say, what, we want to challenge you again in Australia because that's actually where Tony Storm is from really. And then you kind of have them win. And then you ultimately say, okay, we're going to do a best of three. And then the last match to have is that Revolution, really, So you can kind of switch it up a little bit. That's so, I think like I said, the right team won, definitely, both Will Nightingale and Harley Cameron have that story about being underdogs, wanting to win big and do other things like that, So obviously that's good continuity. So I give them credit for that. And then the next things you had the segment of Samoa Joe, and you see Swerve Strickland and Adam Page come down with chains and a staple gun, and they just take out the cronies really, and I'm cool with this because obviously you don't need to do a lot with this. You don't need to do a lot of storytelling because sometimes it's okay to do a little that because you're creating kind of cliffhangers and all that stuff really. So I kind of wonder what's going to happen at World's End. It's going to be a lights out match between Joe and Hangman because you can kind of tell that story, or you can do something like a triple threat match. But I don't think that's even a good idea because if you're going to have Swerve and Hangman and Joe in a triple threat match, Hangman and Swerve are going to actually have to fight each other. You can just do a lights out match with Joe and Hangman, and that would work. But yeah, even though it may be a little repetitive, that would be maybe the right call, really, and I think that would be good. But I also will say that the show kind of dipped for me that you had Mascara Dorada versus John Moxley. There was this thing where John Moxley, I think he was he needed Mascara to grab his leg, and then John Moxley just actually just did like a thing where he missed his move, and then he just threw his leg out for Mascara to grab it. So that just looked like fake as fuck, really. And then the other thing about that was Mascara loses, and this guy has a lot of potential, really. So I don't want to see him become like the jobber. I want to see him win, and I want to see him be featured very well, really, because it also says, oh well, because you're from CMLL, you have to lose, lose, lose. So I just don't want that to happen, really. Before I forget, two big things happened. That you saw Kenny Omega talk to one of the backstage announcers, and he said something along the lines of, he can forgive the Young Bucks because he understands being manipulated by Don Callis. So definitely they're trying to show that, hey, with the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, they are focusing on moving forward. And that's important because, it just says, hey, we're going to not do we're not going to do a run around. We're just going to move forward with this. And I'm also okay with this because obviously with the with the Don Callis family, they don't really have any rivals or whatever. So if you want to do the Young Bucks, Jurassic Express, and Kenny Omega versus the Don Callis family for a while, no problem really. The next thing is that you did a promo with Mark Briscoe, and Mark Briscoe was talking about the importance of family and fighting for people. But once again, I hate these things because Mark Briscoe is a great talker. Why isn't his ass in the middle of the ring? Why isn't he sitting in a chair in the middle of the ring and doing all this shit? Because, when he get over with the Nashville crowd, they do a lot of backstage promos too much. I understand that maybe, he's not that far from Delaware, so they're probably hey, you know what? You're going to go home for Thanksgiving, as a reward. That's probably why that happened, really. But you need to have Mark Briscoe really, really just do more promos in the ring. This has been, a repeated issue with him. You take your best talkers and they talk in the ring. You don't take your best talk. You don't take The Rock, and when The Rock and Austin were the Attitude Era, and Vince McMahon, you don't take those guys and be like, hey, you know what? You're going to talk backstage 99% of the time. You feature... Yeah, you feature the positives, really. And also, too, I like how Hangman is pissed with Joe, really, because, it kind of, because like I said, he's a better title chaser. He's better, because you kind of saw, how he was just fucking pissed. And like I said, that just shows he's a better title chaser. So I really just hope that they kind of do something with this. I really want to see what the next chapter of Joe and Hangman is. The next thing that I want to mention, before I forget, is that Toni Storm came out after Moxley's match, and then she was talking to Maria Shafir. She was doing her sexual comedy jokes, and then she said that it's going to be a street fight holiday death match in Indiana next week. And that's just really, really awesome and stuff like that. And I really like this for two reasons. That number one, obviously Maria Shafir was out there, so she took advantage of the opportunity. That's good continuity. And then they also just said, hey, instead of announcing it by the announcers or whoever, really, Toni Storm's going to come out and she's going to articulate that. Like I said, that's really, really good continuity. And then you had Kevin Knight versus Darby Allin. I wasn't really into this match, and I was surprised that Kevin Knight won because I really thought that he and Speedball are going to be the jobbers. So, I was kind of surprised that he won, really. But usually with the Continental Classic, they always have their stars lose one match and then win the other one. So you kind of have to say to yourself, I don't really believe that Kevin Knight is going to have a lot of success. He's probably going to lose every other match. And I also don't think that Kevin Knight and Speedball, they're not going to be they're not going to be a Will Ospreay. They're not going to be a Kyle Fletcher. They're not going to be anybody else, really. They're just going to be there to be there, really. So I don't really see a future in them outside of being tag team champions or whatever, really. Or even or whatever, so that's an issue. The other thing I will say is that the main event was Orange Cassidy versus Claudio Castagnoli. People know my feelings about Orange Cassidy, where sometimes I just don't watch his matches because I know that, if he's going to do the comedy kicks or not take it seriously, you're going to have Claudio lose. A man that can Cesaro swing the Big Show to a guy who is possibly just an X Division type of wrestler. why would I kind of risk an outcome that would be, just stupid for me. And then, like I said before, that you don't see anything like these wrestlers saying, "Hey, you know what? I'm in the Continental Classic. What does this mean to me? Hey, why is Claudio and Moxley in the Continental Classic?" And they're going to eventually fight each other, So I think there could have been way more stories told. Again, one thing I hate about AEW is that you have the Ring of Honor show next Friday. You don't do a hype package. You don't do like look at our new stars. You don't say, hey, we're gonna have some Continental Classic matches towards Final Battle, because they should do that. And they also don't really have that many good matches. What's going on with Bandito and Brody King? Bandito has to defend his title. You're doing Persephone versus Athena instead of just Mercedes. So, definitely it's not. It's definitely going to be a show just to have a show instead of just of quality, really. So, I mean, like as I said, I think that for Full Gear as a follow up show, it was definitely subpar. Like they could have just done way more and way more stories and way more like, okay, why am I in the tournament? Why does this mean something to me? Why does Will Nightingale and how does Will Nightingale and Harley Cameron feel? How does Bandito feel? Maybe there's going to be Bandito versus Brody King for the ROH Championship because Bandito lost his confidence and Brody King wants to knock some sense back into him. Like, there's so many more things you can kind of do with this. So, like I said, it was a great show. I mean, it had a lot of positives, but the lack of storytelling made it a subpar show.